The diplomatic quarter of Nexus Prime hummed with the constant din of galactic politics. Ambassador Kale Thrixis of the Valorian hegemony strode through the crystalline corridors, his ceremonial war crown catching the artificial starlight that filtered through the station's transparent aluminum walls. Behind him, a retinue of lesser diplomats struggled to keep pace, their scaled feet clicking against the polished deck plating in staccato rhythms that spoke of barely contained aggression. "The JEC proposal is unacceptable," Thrixis growled, into his communication implant, his words automatically translated into the 17 languages required for hegemony military protocol. "Tell War Marshal Vorthan that if the collective attempts to establish mining operations in the Kepler sector, our response will be immediate and overwhelming." Through the massive viewport that dominated the station's central hub, the imposing silhouettes of Valorian dreadnoughts hung in space like metallic predators. Each vessel stretched nearly 5 kilometers from bow to stern, bristling with particle beam arrays and gravity torpedoes. They maintained a perfect defensive formation. Around the station, a not-so-subtle reminder of the hegemony's military supremacy in this sector. Across the hub, the JEC Collective's delegation occupied their own section of the station. Unlike the warm-blooded Valorians, the JEC were silicon-based beings that resembled living crystal formations. Their representative, a cluster entity, known as Resonance of Calculated Intent, pulsed with soft bioluminescent patterns as it processed data streams from across their empire. The JEC didn't speak in the traditional sense. Instead, they transmitted pure information, mathematical concepts, and logical constructs that other species' translation matrices struggled to render into comprehensible language. Mining efficiency. In Kepler sector projects, 347% increase in resource acquisition. The JEC broadcast to anyone within range. Valorian territorial claims lack mathematical foundation. Optimal solution, Valorian withdrawal from contested space. The tension between these two galactic superpowers had been escalating for months. Other smaller civilizations watched nervously from the sidelines, knowing that when empires like the Valorians and JEC clashed, entire star systems could be reduced to cosmic debris. The Draconian Trade Federation had already begun relocating their merchant fleets to safer routes, while the nomadic spiral runners had suspended all operations in the disputed territories. Station Administrator Jorvek Tel Naran, a four-armed Korthani whose species had spent millennia perfecting the art of diplomatic neutrality, monitored the situation from the central command center. His people had built Nexus Prime specifically to serve as neutral ground for such disputes, but even their legendary patience was being tested by the current crisis. "Sir?" called out scanner technician Yila from her position at the sensor array. "I'm detecting an unscheduled arrival. Single vessel, unknown configuration." Jorvek's tertiary arms manipulated holographic displays while his primary hands gestured for more information. "Pirates? Smugglers?" "Negative, sir. The ship is unusual. It's broadcasting on all standard diplomatic frequencies, requesting permission to dock. But there's something strange about the transmission." The main display flickered to life, showing a sleek vessel unlike anything in the galactic databases. It was roughly 200 meters in length, with smooth, organic curves that suggested advanced manufacturing techniques. No obvious weapons were visible, nor the imposing bulk that usually characterized military vessels. Most remarkably, it appeared to be constructed from some kind of blue-white alloy that seemed to shimmer with an inner light. "Patch through their communication," Jorvek ordered. The station's speakers crackled to life with a voice that was unmistakably organic, warm, and strangely melodic. But what made every being in the command center freeze was not the voice itself. It was the fact that they all understood it perfectly, despite each species having entirely different auditory processing systems. "Nexus Prime Control, this is Captain Sarah Chen of the United Earthship Meridian. We are requesting permission to dock for diplomatic purposes. We come as representatives of Earth and its people, seeking dialogue with the galactic community." The silence that followed was deafening. Earth. The name meant nothing to any of the major databases, yet something about it triggered a deep, instinctual unease among the station's inhabitants. It was as if some ancestral memory was stirring in the depths of their collective unconscious. "Run a linguistic analysis," Jorvik whispered to his communications officer. "How are we all understanding this transmission?" "Sir, that's impossible. The signal is somehow translating itself in real time into over 200 different languages and communication protocols simultaneously. Our translation matrices can't even detect how it's being done." Before Jorvik could respond, something extraordinary began to happen throughout the station. Every major diplomatic delegation received the same transmission at precisely the same moment, each in their native language, each with perfect cultural context and appropriate diplomatic phrasing. The message was simple: "We represent Earth. We seek peaceful dialogue." The effect was instantaneous and unprecedented. Ambassador Thrixus stopped mid-stride, his war crown's ceremonial flames flickering as he listened to the transmission. Across the hub, resonance of calculated intense bioluminescent patterns shifted to configurations that the HFY hadn't used in millennia. Patterns associated with deep uncertainty and something approaching what other species might call fear. Then, as if triggered by some galactic signal that only they could perceive, the unthinkable happened. The Valorian dreadnoughts simply stopped. Their weapon systems powered down, their engines went silent, and they began broadcasting a single message on repeat: "All operations suspended pending review." The HFY Collective's massive mining barges, visible as distant stars in the viewport, went dark simultaneously. Their data streams, which had been flowing constantly for over 3,000 years, simply ceased. Throughout the station, representatives from dozens of species began receiving urgent communications from their homeworlds. The Draconian Trade Federation's merchant princes were reporting that their raiding fleets had suddenly returned to port without explanation. The Spiral Runner's nomad chiefs were sending confused messages about their warriors laying down arms and requesting permission to return home. "Administrator." Yela's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm reading massive communication blackouts across 17 sectors. It's like every major empire just went silent." Jorvik stared at the small, unassuming vessel on his screens. The ship called Meridian hung in space with almost casual grace, apparently unaware that its mere presence had somehow triggered the first galactic communications blackout in recorded history. "Grant them docking permission," he said finally, his voice hollow with a growing dread he couldn't name. "Bay 94, and prepare a diplomatic reception." As the human vessel began its approach to the docking bay, Jorvik couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. The galaxy had just gone silent, and somehow he knew that these mysterious humans were the reason why. The age of empires, he realized with crystalline clarity, was about to end. The docking bay fell silent as the airlock cycled open with a soft pneumatic hiss. Administrator Jorvik stood at the head of the reception committee, his forearms clasped in the traditional Korthani gesture of cautious welcome, while his mind raced with unanswered questions. Behind him, a carefully selected group of junior diplomats from various species maintained their positions, though he could sense their nervousness in the subtle changes to their posture and biochemical signatures. The first human to emerge was unremarkable by galactic standards. Captain Sarah Chen stood perhaps 1.7 meters tall, her bipedal form encased in a simple dark blue uniform that bore no visible weapons or technological enhancements. Her skin was a warm brown tone, her hair black and pulled back in a practical style, and her eyes, those strange forward-facing human eyes, surveyed the reception committee with what appeared to be genuine curiosity and warmth. "Administrator Tel Naran, I presume?" she said, stepping forward with a confidence that seemed entirely at odds with her species' apparent fragility. "I'm Captain Sarah Chen. Thank you for accommodating our unexpected arrival." Jorvik found himself momentarily speechless. The human's voice carried that same impossible quality as their initial transmission. He understood every word perfectly, despite knowing no context for their language. More unsettling was the fact that she had pronounced his name correctly, including the subtle tonal variations that carried meaning in Korthani culture. "Captain Chen," he managed, performing the formal bow of greeting. "Welcome to Nexus Prime. I must confess your arrival has created some unusual circumstances. Oh? Chen's eyebrows, those peculiar patches of hair above human optical organs, rose slightly. I hope we haven't caused any inconvenience. We tried to follow standard diplomatic protocols, though I admit we're still learning the proper procedures. Still learning. The phrase sent a chill through Jorvik's spine, though he couldn't articulate why. Behind the captain, two other humans had emerged. A tall, pale male who appeared to be some form of technical specialist, and a shorter female with darker skin who carried what looked like translation equipment, though it was clearly unnecessary. As the diplomatic party moved through the station's corridors toward the reception chambers, Jorvik noticed something that made his skin crawl with unspecified dread. Other species representatives, beings who had been snarling at each other just hours earlier, were stepping aside to let the humans pass, not out of fear or respect, but with something that looked almost like shame. 3 levels below, in the deep archives that formed the intellectual heart of Nexus Prime, Senior, Librarian Vex was experiencing the worst day of his extraordinarily long career. The Mythaxian's crystalline memory matrix was overheating as he processed increasingly disturbing data fragments that had been buried in the station's archaeological databases for millennia. Vex had spent the last 6 hours cross-referencing the word Earth across every historical database he could access, and what he was finding defied all logical explanation. The references were scattered, fragmentary, and ancient, most dating back over 50,000 years to the collapse of the First Galactic Empire. But they were there, hidden in the deepest layers of civilizational memory like scars that had never properly healed. The first reference had come from a Valorian historical text that predated their current empire by 30 millennia. The mediators from the third planet arrived during the Crimson Wars. After they spoke, the great fleets turned away from battle and sought forgiveness from those they had wronged. A Jek collective memory crystal contained an even more disturbing fragment. Mathematical impossibility detected. Species designation human. Capability. Inducement of logical paradox in combat protocols. Result. Voluntary cessation of optimal strategies. Recommend immediate data purge. But it was the discovery of a pre-galactic artifact that truly made Vex's exoskeleton tremble with fear. Hidden in a sealed archive that hadn't been accessed in over 40,000 years was a warning beacon left by an unknown civilization. The message was simple, carved in a primitive but elegant script that seemed to bypass translation entirely. They called themselves human. They came from a small blue world in the outer spiral. They carried no weapons, commanded no fleets, conquered no worlds. Yet after they passed through our empire, the silence followed. Not the silence of death, but something far worse, the silence of shame. We disbanded our armies not because we were defeated, but because we could no longer bear to look at what we had become. Beware the ones who make you see yourself clearly. Beware the ones who make you want to be better. They are more dangerous than any conqueror, for they conquer not your body but your soul. Vex's claws clicked against his workstation as he transmitted an emergency bulletin to the historical departments of every major civilization. Within minutes, his communication array was overwhelmed with responses, each species historians confirming similar findings in their own deepest archives. The Draconian Trade Federation's oldest quantum storage contained records of the quiet ending of the Prophet Wars that coincided exactly with reported human contact. The Spiral Runner's oral traditions spoke of the day the warriors forgot how to hate. Even the machine intelligence known as the Nexus Collective had buried references to a logic cascade failure that had occurred during their species' most aggressive expansion phase. Meanwhile, in the diplomatic quarters, Captain Chen was conducting what appeared to be a routine meet and greet with various species representatives. To casual observers, the conversation seemed mundane. Discussions of trade routes, cultural, exchange possibilities, and standard diplomatic pleasantries. But to those who looked more carefully, something deeply unsettling was occurring. Ambassador Thrixus found himself in the unusual position of actually listening to another being's perspective for the first time in decades. When Chen asked about Valorian expansion policies, her questions weren't challenges. They were genuine inquiries about the welfare of Valorian citizens. Did the constant warfare truly make their people safer? Had they considered the psychological impact of perpetual military mobilization on their young? Were there alternative approaches that might achieve their security goals without the massive resource expenditure? We have always believed that strength ensures survival, Thrixis said slowly, his war crown's flames dimming as he spoke. Of course, Chen nodded with what appeared to be genuine understanding. Survival is paramount, but I'm curious, do your people feel truly secure? In our experience, societies that achieve lasting security often do so through very different means than those that achieve temporary dominance. The question hung in the air like a blade poised to strike. Thrixis realized with growing horror that he didn't actually know if his people felt secure. When had he last asked them? When had any Valorian leader bothered to measure their citizens' actual well-being rather than their military capabilities? Across the station, similar conversations were taking place. The Zhek Collective's resonance of calculated intent found itself recalculating fundamental equations for the first time in centuries. Chen's questions about resource efficiency weren't challenges to Zhek methodology, they were improvements to it. The humans seemed to possess mathematical models that made Zhek calculations look primitive, yet they shared this knowledge freely, with no apparent expectation of gain. By the end of the first day, word had spread throughout the Galactic community through every available communication channel. The humans weren't conquerors, weren't traitors, weren't even particularly advanced by galactic standards. They were something far more terrifying. They were teachers, and their first lesson was helping each species see themselves as they truly were, not as they pretended to be, not as their propaganda claimed, but as their actions and choices had made them. As the station's night cycle began, Jorvik stood in his private quarters, staring out at the stars and trying to comprehend what was happening to the galaxy. Every major empire had gone silent, not from fear of human weapons, but from the far more devastating realization that they might have been wrong about everything. The humans slept peacefully in their assigned quarters, completely unaware that their presence had triggered the first galactic identity crisis in recorded history. Tomorrow, Chen had mentioned, she would like to discuss sustainable development, models, and ethical resource distribution frameworks. Jorvik shuddered. If one day of human diplomacy could bring the galaxy to its knees, what would a week accomplish? What would a month do? He had the terrifying suspicion that he was about to find out. The emergency session of the Galactic Historical Council convened in the deepest secure chambers of Nexus Prime, 47 levels below the diplomatic quarters where Captain Chen and her team continued their seemingly innocent meetings. Representatives from dozens of civilizations had arrived via quantum transmission, their holographic forms flickering with urgency around the circular amphitheater that had been designed for far less apocalyptic discussions. Senior Librarian Vex stood at the center podium, his crystalline form pulsing with barely contained distress as he prepared to deliver the most terrifying historical briefing in galactic memory. Around him, the greatest minds in archaeological research waited with growing dread for confirmation of what they had all begun to suspect. Colleagues, Vex began, his voice carrying the harmonic resonance that indicated maximum priority communications among his people. What I am about to share with you challenges everything we believed we knew about galactic history. 26 hours ago, we had no record of a species called human in our databases. Today I can confirm that not only do such records exist, but they have been systematically buried, encrypted, or otherwise hidden across every major civilization's archives. The holographic form of Dr. Krexhai, the Draconian Federation's chief, historian leaned forward with obvious agitation. Explain systematically buried, Librarian Vex. Are you suggesting a coordinated cover-up spanning multiple species over tens of millennia? No, Vex replied, his crystalline structure shifting to configurations associated with deep uncertainty. I believe our ancestors didn't want to remember. The data suggests voluntary suppression, entire civilizations choosing to forget their encounters with humanity rather than preserve the memory. High Scholar Threnk of the Valorian Historical Academy materialized in the chamber, her war crown's flames burning with the low blue fire of profound concern. "Present your evidence." Librarian. "My people's quantum storage banks have yielded disturbing fragments." Vex activated the central holographic display, and the chamber filled with ghostly images of ancient data fragments, archaeological finds, and linguistic analysis. The earliest confirmed reference dates to 52,147 galactic standard years ago, during the height of the First Galactic Empire. The Eternal Dominion, the most powerful military force in recorded history, was engaged in what they called the Final Conquest, a campaign to bring every inhabitable world under their direct control. The display showed star charts depicting the vast scope of the Eternal Dominion's empire, stretching across nearly a quarter of the galaxy. Their military might had been legendary: planet-killing dreadnoughts, reality-warping weapons, the ability to relocate entire star systems for tactical advantage. According to these fragments, Vex continued, the Dominion's conquest was proceeding exactly as planned until they encountered a small delegation from what they recorded as the third planet of an unremarkable yellow star. The delegation consisted of 12 individuals calling themselves human. Dr. Krexhigh's draconic features twisted into an expression of disbelief. 12 individuals against the Eternal Dominion? The records become strange after that point, Vex admitted. Multiple sources describe the same sequence of events, but in terms that seem almost mythological. The humans requested an audience with Emperor Vexcon the Destroyer. They were granted 1 hour to present their petition for peace. The holographic display shifted, showing artistic reconstructions based on the fragmentary records. The Eternal Dominion's capital ship, a moon-sized fortress capable of reducing entire solar systems to ash, hung in space like a metal god. Approaching it was a vessel so small, it was barely visible on the same scale. The meeting lasted 7 hours, Vex said quietly. At the end of it, Emperor Vexcon transmitted a single message to his entire empire. The campaign is over. All forces are to return home immediately. Disarmament will begin at once. Within 1 galactic standard year, the Eternal Dominion had voluntarily disbanded. The most powerful empire in galactic history simply chose to stop existing. The silence in the chamber was deafening. Finally, Resonance of Pure Logic, the Zhek Collective's representative, transmitted a question. Define chose to stop existing. This statement contains logical impossibilities. That's precisely the problem, Vex replied. Every record from that period describes the same impossible phenomenon. The Dominion's military commanders, their political leaders, their civilian population, they all simply decided they didn't want to be an empire anymore. They dismantled their weapons, terraformed worlds instead of conquering them, and spent the next 1,000 years what they called making amends to species they had previously subjugated. High Scholar Threnk's flames flickered with growing unease. You said this was the earliest confirmed reference. There were others? Dozens, Vex confirmed grimly. The pattern repeats throughout galactic history, always the same. Aggressive civilizations encounter humans, brief period of contact, then voluntary self-reformation or complete dissolution. The Crimson Hegemony, the Void Hunters, the Machine, Orthodoxy, the Neural Collective. Every major aggressive empire that disappeared from the historical record did so immediately after documented human contact. Dr. Krexhigh stood abruptly, her holographic form flickering with agitation. The Prophet Wars, she whispered. In our oldest archives there are references to the year of empty coffers. Our ancestors stopped raiding, stopped conquering, started giving things back to people they had stolen from. The historical records claim it was due to a great enlightenment, but they never explain what caused it. The Zhek Collective possesses similar discontinuities, Resonance of Pure Logic transmitted. Approximately 34,000 years ago, our expansion protocols underwent what was recorded as spontaneous ethical revision. All aggressive acquisition activities ceased. Resource allocation became focused on mutual benefit rather than optimal extraction. Our mathematical historians classified this as the Great Computational Error, as no logical explanation could be found for the strategic shift. Around the chamber, similar confirmations began emerging. The spiral runners had legends of the day the warriors learned to weep. The Nexus Collective's machine archives contained fragmented records of empathy cascade failures that had somehow improved their efficiency rather than destroying it. Even the nomadic deep dwellers spoke in their crystalline songs of the silence that taught sound. Vex continued his presentation, each new piece of evidence painting a more disturbing picture. What's most troubling is the consistency of the aftermath. Every civilization that encountered humans didn't just stop being aggressive, they became actively beneficial to the galactic community. They began contributing rather than taking, helping rather than conquering, building rather than destroying. You speak as if this were a terrible thing, observed Elder Keth of the Spiral Runners, her ancient voice carrying the weight of millennia. It is terrible, Vex replied with crystalline certainty, because it means these humans possess a capability that defies all known principles of psychology, sociology, and political science. They can somehow convince entire civilizations to fundamentally alter their core behavioral patterns. Not through force, not through technology, but through conversation. The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. If the historical pattern held true, then every major empire currently in existence was potentially one conversation away from voluntary dissolution. The Valorian hegemony's military might, the Jet Collective's technological superiority, the Draconian Federation's economic dominance, none of it would matter if the humans could simply talk them out of it. There's one more thing, Vex said, his voice dropping to barely audible levels. In every case, the civilizations that encountered humans described the experience as liberating. They claimed to feel relief, joy, even gratitude for being shown a better way. The records suggest that the humans didn't force these changes. They made other species want to change. High Scholar Thrank's flames guttered to almost nothing. That's impossible. You can't make someone want to give up power. It goes against every principle of evolutionary psychology. And yet, Vex replied, gesturing to the mountain of evidence surrounding them, here we are. The humans have returned, and already we're seeing the same pattern emerge. The Valorian fleet has powered down. The Zhek expansion has halted. Your own people, High Scholar, have begun questioning their territorial policies for the first time in centuries. The chamber fell silent as the full horror of their situation became clear. They weren't facing an invasion or a conquest. They were facing something far worse. The possibility that everything they had built their civilizations on was wrong, and that a small group of bipedal primates from an unremarkable planet could prove it to them in ways they wouldn't be able to resist. Above them, 47 levels up, Captain Chen was sitting down to breakfast with Administrator Jorvek, chatting pleasantly about sustainable agricultural practices and wondering why everyone seemed so nervous around her team. The age of empires was ending not with war but with wisdom, and somehow that was the most terrifying prospect any of them had ever faced. Captain Sarah Chen stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of Conference Chamber Alpha, watching the morning cycle illuminate Nexus Prime's exterior hull as she reviewed her notes for the day's diplomatic meetings. Her tablet, a remarkably simple device by galactic standards, contained detailed psychological profiles, economic analyses, and cultural studies of every major civilization in this sector. What made her preparation extraordinary wasn't the depth of research, but the compassionate precision with which she planned to use it. Dr. Martinez, she called to her cultural attaché who was setting up holographic displays across the conference table. Are you certain about the Valorian psychological markers? I want to be absolutely sure we're addressing their actual concerns, not just their surface positions. Dr. Elena Martinez, a slight woman whose unremarkable appearance concealed one of humanity's most brilliant xenopsychology minds, nodded while adjusting a three-dimensional economic model. The pattern is clear, Captain. Valorian aggression stems from deep-seated fear of vulnerability, likely originating from their homeworld's harsh evolutionary environment. Their entire military doctrine is built on the premise that strength prevents suffering. If we can demonstrate that their current approach actually increases the suffering of their own people, then we show them a better way. Chen finished, with a warm smile. Not because we're telling them what to do, but because they'll want what's best for their citizens. Unknown to the humans, their conversation was being monitored by every intelligence agency in the sector. In secure facilities across the galaxy, xenopsychologists, military strategists, and political theorists were analyzing every word, trying desperately to understand what made these creatures so dangerous. At precisely 0900 station time, War Marshal Krone Vorthen entered the conference chamber. The Valorian military commander stood nearly 3 meters tall, his exoskeleton gleaming with ceremonial battle scarring that told the story of 100 conquered worlds. His war crown, an ancient artifact passed down through generations of Valorian leaders, burned with the traditional flames of conquest. He expected to face either supplicants seeking mercy or enemies offering challenge. Instead, Captain Chen stood and offered him a simple, respectful bow. "War Marshal Vorthen," she said in perfectly accented Valorian high military, "thank you for meeting with us. Please sit wherever you're most comfortable." Vorthen found himself momentarily disoriented. The human had used not just his language, but the specific dialectical variation reserved for addressing honored military equals. When had he last been spoken to with such genuine respect by a non-Valorian? "You may speak, human," he said, settling his massive frame into a chair that had been specifically reinforced for Valorian physiology. How had they known to prepare for his weight distribution? Chen activated a holographic display showing detailed schematics of Valorian society, population distributions, resource allocation, citizen welfare indices, military expenditure ratios. But these weren't intelligence reports or strategic analyses. They were humanitarian assessments. "War Marshal, we've been studying your civilization, and we're genuinely impressed by the Valorian people's resilience and dedication to their families," Chen began. "Your species has survived in one of the galaxy's most challenging environments, and your success is remarkable." Vorthen's flames flickered with surprise. Praise? From a potential enemy? "However," Chen continued gently, "we've noticed some concerning patterns in your current societal structure that might be undermining the very security you're working to achieve." The holographic display shifted, showing Valorian cities. But, instead of military installations and fortifications, it focused on civilian populations. Chen highlighted areas where Valorian citizens lived in poverty, despite their empire's vast wealth. Regions where young Valorians were showing signs of psychological trauma from constant military mobilization, families separated for decades by endless conquest campaigns. "Your military expenditure currently represents 73% of your total resource allocation," Chen said, her voice carrying no judgment, only genuine concern. "That's extraordinary dedication to security. But we're curious. Do your people feel secure?" The question hit Vorthen like a physical blow. When had anyone ever asked him that? When had any Valorian leader bothered to measure actual citizen welfare rather than military capability? "Our strength ensures our survival," he replied automatically, the response drilled into him through centuries of military doctrine. "Of course," Chen nodded with understanding. "Survival is paramount. That's why we're concerned. You see, we've observed a pattern in our own history where societies that spend the majority of their resources on military preparedness often become less secure over time, not more." Dr. Martinez activated a new display showing comparative analyses from human history. Civilizations that had collapsed despite overwhelming military might. Nations that had achieved lasting security through entirely different approaches. "The mathematics are fascinating," Chen continued. "Your current approach requires constant expansion to maintain resource flow for military operations. But expansion creates new threats, which require larger militaries, which require more resources, which require more expansion. It's a feedback loop that actually decreases security over time while exponentially increasing the suffering of your people." Forthan stared at the display, his analytical military mind processing the implications. The human was right. Valorian society was trapped in an escalating cycle that benefited no one, not even the military leaders who perpetuated it. "You speak of alternatives," he said slowly. "What would you have us do? Abandon our defenses? Leave ourselves vulnerable to our enemies?" "Not at all," Chen replied warmly. "We'd suggest a gradual transition to what we call sustainable security, a model that achieves greater actual safety for your people while dramatically reducing resource expenditure and citizen suffering." The next 2 hours were the most intellectually devastating experience of Vorthan's life. The humans presented alternative security models with mathematical precision, showing how defensive rather than offensive strategies could provide superior protection at a fraction of the cost. They demonstrated economic frameworks that would increase Valorian prosperity while reducing the need for resource acquisition campaigns. Most damaging of all, they showed him citizen satisfaction surveys from their own world, a planet where people felt genuinely safe and happy, despite having no aggressive military at all. But this would mean admitting we were wrong," Forthan said finally, his flames dimming to nearly nothing. "That everything we've done, every world we've conquered, every enemy we've defeated, it was all unnecessary." Chen's expression filled with compassion. "War Marshal, you've spent your entire life trying to protect your people in the only way your society taught you how. There's no shame in discovering better methods. The shame would be in continuing harmful practices once you know alternatives exist." As Vorthan left the meeting in a daze, similar conversations were taking place across the station. Resonance of calculated intent found itself recalculating fundamental efficiency equations as Dr. Martinez demonstrated how the JEC Collective's resource extraction methods were actually suboptimal from a mathematical standpoint. "Your current mining operations achieve 67% efficiency," Martinez explained to the crystalline entity. "But if you shifted to collaborative terraforming with the worlds you're mining, you could achieve 89% efficiency while actually improving the ecosystems rather than destroying them." The JEC entity's bioluminescent patterns shifted to configurations it hadn't used in millennia, patterns associated with the discovery of more elegant mathematical solutions. "Demonstrate," it transmitted simply. What followed was a detailed presentation of human ecological engineering, showing how symbiotic relationships with planetary ecosystems could yield vastly superior resource returns than extractive mining. The humans didn't just criticize JEC methods, they provided better ones. Meanwhile, Captain Chen was meeting with representatives from the notorious Crimson Corsairs, the most feared pirate confederation in the sector. Their leader, a scarred draconian known as Bloodclaw Xeris, had expected to negotiate tribute or territorial agreements. Instead, Chen showed him economic projections demonstrating that his current piracy operations were actually losing money when properly calculated, creating more poverty in the systems he depended on for resources, and ensuring long-term decline for his own people. "You're spending 80% of your operational budget on defensive measures against the military responses your raids provoke," Chen pointed out. "Meanwhile, the economic damage you're inflicting on trade routes is reducing the overall wealth of the I sector, which means less valuable cargo to steal. You're essentially eating your own resource base." Xeris stared at the holographic economic models with growing horror. The human was absolutely right. Piracy was an inherently self-defeating business model. The transformation began in the most unlikely place, the engine room of the Valorian dreadnought Eternal Wrath, flagship of the Third Conquest Fleet. Chief Engineer Vexitar had served the hegemony for 67 years, maintaining the massive reactors that powered weapons capable of cracking planets. He had never questioned his role until the encrypted report from War Marshal Vorthan arrived in his personal communications buffer. The report contained detailed human analyses of Valorian society, including projections showing that the current military expenditure was bankrupting their homeworld's social infrastructure. But what stopped Vexitar cold wasn't the economic data. It was a simple graph showing Valorian civilian mortality rates compared to military casualties. For every soldier who died in conquest, 17 civilians died from neglect, inadequate health care, and resource deprivation. Systems Chief Korth, he called to his second-in-command, access the following data. Civilian infrastructure budgets for the last 50 cycles. Korth's claws clicked nervously against his workstation. Chief, that information is classified, above our clearance level. Then breach the classification, Vextar said quietly. I need to know what we've done. 3 hours later, the entire engineering crew of the Eternal Wrath sat in stunned silence as they processed the data. Their homeworld's hospitals were collapsing, educational systems were failing. Elderly Valorians were dying in poverty while their government spent fortunes on weapons that only created more enemies. The engineers, beings who had devoted their lives to making war machines function, were discovering that their work was slowly killing everything they claimed to protect. Chief, whispered Maintenance Specialist Jerahai, his voice barely audible over the reactor's hum. What do we do with this information? Vextar stared at the readouts, his war crown's flames flickering with uncertainty. Then, with deliberate precision, he began shutting down non-essential weapon systems. We start by not making it worse. The same scene was playing out across the Valorian fleet. As War Marshal Vorthan's report circulated through command channels, officers at every level began asking questions they had never been encouraged to ask. What were they actually protecting? Were their methods working? Could there be better ways? On the bridge of the Iron Conviction, Captain Morthak received a communication from his daughter on the homeworld. She was 12 years old and had been accepted into an advanced education program, except the program had been canceled due to budget cuts. The funding had been redirected to build more warships like the one he commanded. Morthak found himself staring at the tactical display showing his ship's target, a small agricultural world whose only crime was refusing to pay tribute to the hegemony. Tomorrow, he was scheduled to demonstrate Valorian power by destroying their primary food production facility. Tonight, for the first time in his career, he wondered if he was the villain in someone else's story. Across the galaxy, the Zhek Collective was experiencing its own crisis of mathematical faith. Resonance of calculated intent had distributed the human efficiency models throughout the collective consciousness, and the results were catastrophic to their worldview. Every major Zhek industrial operation was revealed to be suboptimal, not just slightly inefficient but dramatically wasteful, compared to the collaborative methods the humans had demonstrated. Mining entity Theta Prime, responsible for resource extraction from 17 star systems, made a decision that would have been inconceivable just days earlier. Instead of beginning the scheduled strip mining of the Kepler 442 system, it sent a communication to the indigenous species offering to teach them advanced terraforming techniques in exchange for voluntary resource sharing agreements. The response from the Kepler 442 natives was immediate and overwhelming: gratitude, relief, and eager cooperation. Within hours, they were sharing geological surveys that revealed resource deposits the Zhek had missed entirely. The collaborative approach yielded 340% more materials than strip mining would have provided, while actually improving the planetary ecosystems. The mathematical elegance of cooperation was spreading through the collective like a virus of logic. Mining operations across Zhek space began transforming from extractive raids into collaborative development projects. The results were uniformly superior to previous methods, which created a psychological crisis among beings who had spent millennia believing their civilization represented the pinnacle of mathematical perfection. Meanwhile, in the lawless Crimson Nebula, pirate Captain Scarlock was having the worst week of his criminal career. He had attended Bloodclaw Xeris's briefing about the human economic projections, initially dismissing them as elaborate deception, but curiosity had driven him to run the calculations himself using his own ship's operational data. The results were undeniable. His piracy operation was losing money. When properly accounting for maintenance costs, crew hazard pay, defensive expenditures, and the declining value of targets in overrated sectors, his notorious vessel Blood Prophet was operating at a 23% loss. They were paying for the privilege of being criminals. "Navigator Thresh," he called to his second-in-command, "what's our current destination?" The merchant convoy from Draconia Prime, Captain. Scheduled intercept in 6 hours. Scarlock stared at the tactical display showing the convoy, 12, cargo vessels carrying medical supplies to refugee camps in the outer systems. If he raided them, desperate people would die from lack of medicine. If he didn't raid them, his crew would face another month of declining profits and growing debt. For the first time in his career as a pirate, Scarlock made a different choice. Signal the convoy, he ordered. Offer them escort services through the nebula, standard mercenary rates. The response from the convoy was shocked gratitude. The pay for legitimate escort work was higher than they would have earned from raiding. The medical supplies and the convoy leader offered them a long-term contract for regular freight security. Within days, similar conversions were spreading throughout the Crimson Corsairs. Pirates were discovering that legitimate security work paid better than theft, involved less risk, and somehow made them feel better about themselves. The psychological impact was devastating to criminal morale. It was hard to maintain a fearsome reputation when you kept helping people. On Nexus Prime, Administrator Jorvek watched these developments with growing amazement and terror. His communication arrays were overwhelmed with reports from across the sector, military fleets powering down weapons, mining operations converting to collaboration, pirates becoming security contractors. The humans had been on the station for exactly 72 hours, and the fundamental nature of galactic civilization was already transforming. "Sir," his aide Yila reported with barely concealed panic, "we're receiving formal requests from 17 different species asking for human consultation on sustainable development frameworks and ethical governance models. The Spiral Runners want help designing what they're calling non-exploitative resource distribution networks. The Draconian Trade Federation is requesting assistance with something called post-scarcity economic transition planning." Jorvek's forearms trembled as he processed the implications. The humans hadn't conquered the galaxy through force. They had conquered it through homework assignments. Every species was voluntarily seeking instruction on how to improve their societies. "What are the humans doing right now?" he asked. Captain Chen is in Conference Room 7, discussing sustainable agricultural techniques with a delegation from the Outer Rim farming collectives. Dr. Martinez is in the archives, apparently helping the Historical Council develop what she calls trauma-informed approaches to civilizational healing. Their technical specialist is in Engineering Bay 12, showing our maintenance crews more efficient power distribution methods that could reduce station energy consumption by 40%. Each human activity sounded innocuous, even helpful, yet collectively, they represented the systematic dismantling of every power structure, economic model, and social hierarchy that had defined galactic civilization for millennia. The most terrifying aspect was how eager everyone seemed to be dismantled. Species that had spent centuries hating each other were collaborating on joint projects suggested by human mediation. Military commanders were voluntarily reducing their forces and redirecting resources to civilian welfare. Even the most hardened criminals were spontaneously developing ethical frameworks for their operations. Late that evening, Jorvek stood in his private quarters, reviewing reports that read like fantasy novels. The Valorian Third Fleet had announced it was converting from conquest operations to disaster relief and infrastructure development. The Zhek Collective had begun offering free terraforming services to underdeveloped worlds. The Crimson Corsairs had established what they were calling the Reformed Privateers Mutual Aid Society. A soft chime indicated an incoming communication from Captain Chen. "Administrator Jorvek." Her voice carried its usual warm concern. "I hope we're not causing too much disruption with our visit. We've noticed some unusual activity in the sector. Lots of species seem to be implementing new policies and restructuring their operations. We're not sure if that's normal for this region, but we wanted to make sure we weren't somehow interfering with established diplomatic prati." 3 months had passed since the UES Meridian's arrival at Nexus Prime, and the galaxy was unrecognizable. Where once the hyperspace lanes had thrummed with the constant movement of war fleets, now they carried hospital ships, terraforming vessels, and collaborative research expeditions. The Valorian Third Fleet had become the third humanitarian armada, its planet-killing dreadnoughts converted into mobile disaster relief platforms. The HFY Collective's mining barges had transformed into ecosystem restoration ships, reversing centuries of environmental damage across dozens of worlds. Captain Sarah Chen stood in the observation deck of Nexus Prime, watching a sight that would have been impossible just months earlier. A joint Valorian-HFY draconian construction project, building the galaxy's first truly democratic trade hub. The three species that had been on the verge of a devastating war were now working together to create something that would benefit everyone. Dr. Martinez, she said to her cultural attaché, who was reviewing the final diplomatic accords, have you ever seen anything like this before? The level of cooperation they've achieved is remarkable. Elena Martinez looked up from her tablet, suppressing a smile at her captain's continued obliviousness to their own role in these transformations. It is extraordinary, Sarah. Though I think they had the capacity for this all along. They just needed someone to show them it was possible. Behind them, Administrator Jorvik approached with the measured steps of someone who had watched his entire understanding of politics and society crumble and rebuild over the past quarter year. His forearms carried data tablets containing the most significant documents in galactic history, the Nexus Accords, a comprehensive peace and cooperation framework that every major civilization had not only signed, but had enthusiastically contributed to creating. Captain Chen, he said, his voice carrying a warmth that would have been impossible during their first meeting. The final signatures have been recorded. The accords are now officially in effect across 847 star systems. Chen turned from the viewport with genuine pleasure. That's wonderful news, Administrator. Though I have to admit the credit belongs entirely to all of you. We just facilitated some conversations. You did all the real work of building these frameworks. Jorvik's expression shifted to something between amazement and gentle despair. Even now, after witnessing the systematic transformation of galactic civilization, the humans seemed to genuinely believe they had merely been helpful observers rather than the architects of the most profound revolution in recorded history. Captain, he said carefully, I hope you won't think me presumptuous, but many of us have been wondering, what comes next? The galaxy has changed dramatically since your arrival, and we're curious about Earth's long-term intentions. Chen's eyebrows rose in that peculiarly human expression of surprise. Intentions? Oh, we don't have any intentions beyond what we've already accomplished. Our mission was to make contact and assess whether the galactic community was ready for formal diplomatic relations with Earth. Based on what we've seen, I think the answer is clearly yes. She activated a holographic display, showing a star chart of the local galactic region. Earth has been observing this sector for several centuries through long-range scanning and probe data. We've been waiting for the right moment to introduce ourselves, specifically waiting for everyone to reach a level of social and ethical development that would make productive cooperation possible. The implications hit Jorvik like a physical blow. You've been watching us for centuries? Oh yes, Chen replied with casual warmth. We learned long ago that premature contact with developing civilizations can be harmful for everyone involved. We needed to wait until you were ready to engage with truly post-scarcity, post-conflict societies without feeling threatened or inadequate. Dr. Martinez stepped forward, adding, What you've accomplished here over the past 3 months has demonstrated that readiness beautifully. The voluntary transformation of your economic systems, the collaborative approach to resource management, the peaceful resolution of territorial disputes, these are exactly the indicators we look for. Administrator Jorvik felt his worldview shifting once again. When you say post-scarcity, post-conflict societies, are you referring to Earth specifically, or the Galactic Cooperative? Chen said simply. Earth is part of a much larger community, about 40,000 inhabited worlds across this spiral arm, all operating under similar principles to what you've been developing here. We've all gone through the same transition you're experiencing now. The silence that followed was profound. Jorvik realized that everything they had accomplished, the peace accords, the collaborative frameworks, the ethical governance models, represented not revolutionary innovation, but simply reaching the minimum standards for joining a galactic civilization that dwarfed their current understanding. 40,000 worlds, he whispered. Give or take a few hundred, Chen replied cheerfully. The exact number changes as new species achieve developmental readiness and choose to join. It's entirely voluntary, of course. Some civilizations prefer to remain independent, and that's perfectly fine, but most find that cooperation yields better results than isolation. She gestured to the viewport, where the multi-species construction project continued its work. What you're building here isn't just a trade hub. It's essentially an application to join the broader galactic community. And based on what we've observed, I think you'll be very welcome. 3 hours later, representatives from every major civilization in the sector gathered in Nexus Prime's largest conference chamber for what they now understood was not a diplomatic meeting, but a graduation ceremony. The humans had prepared a presentation that recontextualized everything they thought they knew about the galaxy. The holographic display showed star charts revealing the true scope of galactic civilization, vast networks of cooperative worlds, peaceful trade routes spanning multiple galactic arms, collaborative scientific projects on scales they had never imagined. What they had thought was the galaxy was revealed to be a small, somewhat backward frontier region that had been quarantined until it could develop beyond aggressive imperialism. The silence you experienced when we first arrived, Dr. Martinez explained to the assembled representatives, wasn't fear of human power. It was your civilization's subconscious recognition that you were finally ready to stop pretending that conquest and exploitation were sustainable strategies. War Marshal Vorthan, whose flames now burned with the steady blue light of peaceful contemplation rather than martial aggression, raised one massive claw. You're saying that our empires, our conflicts, our entire way of life, it was essentially a developmental phase? A necessary one, Chen assured him with genuine respect. Every civilization goes through periods of competitive expansion and resource conflict. It's part of learning how societies function. But eventually, most species discover that cooperation yields better results than competition. And that's when they're ready for broader galactic community. Resonance of calculated intent, transmitted a query. Define better results in quantifiable terms. Dr. Martinez smiled and activated a new display showing comparative economic data. Species in the Galactic Cooperative averaged 340% higher citizen satisfaction indices, 89% reduction in resource scarcity, 76% increase in scientific advancement, rates and virtual elimination of large-scale conflict. Plus, they report significantly higher levels of what humans call meaning and purpose in their daily lives. The mathematical elegance of the data sent cascades of approval through the JEC Collective's consciousness. Not only was cooperation more ethical than competition, it was dramatically more efficient. As the presentation continued, the assembled representatives began to understand that they weren't just signing peace treaties, they were graduating from galactic kindergarten. The humans hadn't conquered them or manipulated them. They had simply created conditions where each species could discover for themselves what they truly wanted to be. There is one requirement for joining the cooperative, Chen mentioned as the formal discussions began to wind down. Each member civilization must contribute something unique to the broader community. Your recent innovations in collaborative governance, restorative justice frameworks, and interspecies cooperation models would be valuable additions to our collective knowledge base. Former pirate Captain Scarlock, who now served as coordinator of the reformed Privateers Mutual Aid Society, asked the question that was on everyone's minds. What happens if we choose not to join? If we prefer to remain independent? Then you remain independent, Chen replied simply. We'll maintain friendly diplomatic relations, offer assistance if requested, and check back in a few centuries to see how you're doing. The choice is entirely yours. The vote was unanimous. 2 weeks later, the UES Meridian prepared for departure, but it would not be traveling alone. Following in its wake was a massive flotilla. Former warships converted to exploration vessels, ex-mining barges transformed into research platforms, reformed pirate ships now serving as cultural exchange vessels. Nearly 1,000 ships carrying representatives from across the sector. all heading toward a small blue world in an unremarkable stellar system.